Hello, everybody. So we're going to get started here. First off, thank you all for joining us today, and a big thank you to our presenters. This event is part of a series of webinars that we are doing to introduce people to MDS, which is the open source tool that we're building to help cities manage their transportation system. So I am the executive director of the Open Mobility Foundation, Yasha Franklin Hodge. Prior to my work here, I served as the Chief Information Officer for the City of Boston and was a visiting fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. So I am going to kick off by talking a little bit about the OMF and what MDS is all about, and then we're going to hand it over to our great group of presenters who we have for you today. So the OMF is a city-led, nonprofit, open source software foundation that helps government and industry collaborate. And specifically, the goal is to help build the digital infrastructure that can help cities manage public space and public streets for the public good. We do this by developing open source tools and data standards that support adoption and regulation of emerging mobility technology. And we are a public-private collaboration that tries to encourage the growth of new mobility services by bringing our members who are public and private sector to the table to work together. You can see some examples of our members. This is not a complete list, but we have a really broad cross-section of different companies and cities in this space who are all collaborating under the OMF's umbrella. Everything we build is free to use under open source licensing models. All of our tools are developed and adopted via an open and participatory process, and anybody can be a part of it, whether you're a member or not. So if you want to become part of this work that you hear about today, you can take a look at our website. You'll find more information about membership as well as ways to get involved as a technical contributor, whether or not you're a member of OMF. So before we get started with the content, though, I wanted to speak briefly about what the Mobility Data Specification actually is. I know many of you are probably familiar with it already, but our core product, MDS, is a collection of digital tools that help cities better manage transportation in the public right-of-way. MDS standardizes communication and data sharing between cities and private mobility providers like e-scooter companies or bike-share operators. And MDS does this by allowing cities to share and validate their policies digitally, enabling better vehicle management and better outcomes for residents. Plus, it provides mobility service providers with a framework that they can reuse as they enter new markets, which allows for more collaboration and faster deployment of services. Lastly, by having a data standard, MDS serves to help catalyze an ecosystem of technology companies and software providers who can help support cities and companies as they move forward in this space. Now, MDS is built as a kit of parts. Not every city is going to have the same regulatory structure or priorities, and MDS allows cities to choose from a set of tools the things that work best to fit their local needs. But there are three primary components to MDS, and these are the APIs that exist within this kit of parts that we've created. And each one allows private mobility, it allows cities and providers to communicate in different ways. So the provider API is the first one, which allows private mobility companies to report data to cities on the number, location, status, and ride history of devices that are in use on public streets. The agency API allows more real-time updates and collaboration between city officials and providers when a city needs, when there's more complex transportation problems that demand more dynamic solutions. And the policy API, which is our newest API, allows cities to set rules for how and where different vehicles can operate, how many can operate, and other kinds of high-level policy goals. So today's webinar is going to focus on the policy API. In the future, we'll cover some of those other parts in the kit, but today we're going to talk about policy. And all of our presenters today are OMF members, and they're going to share how they're using the policy API now to dynamically manage public streets. And in the spirit of this being a kind of participatory community where people bring their ideas and their inspiration to the work that we do, they're also going to showcase some of the other exciting collaborations that they're involved with and cover ideas that they might have for future applications of this API, even things that may not be part of the spec today or endorsed by OMF today. You know, we ask our members to bring that creative spark to the work that we do and to share it with the community to help inspire the direction that we go with our sort of official product. So here's our agenda. So we're gonna first hear about some of the vision for this API, both when it was created and where it might be headed. Then we're going to hear from the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, the City of Louisville, the Portland Bureau of Transportation, about how they're implementing the policy API with support from companies Ellis & Associates, Stae, and Ride Report. So all these folks are going to be presenting today. We hope it's informative and lively. We are going to save the Q&A for the end of the webinar, but feel free to put questions into the Q&A box on Zoom as we go along, and we'll be curating those at the end and having a discussion. So that everybody knows, we are recording this webinar. And with that, I think we're going to kick it over to Todd Peterson from Ellis & Associates, who's going to start by sharing a little bit more about the vision for this API, where it started, where it is, and where it might be headed. So Todd, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thanks, Yasha. Appreciate it. All right. Angela, are you going to move control over, or Yasha?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and do that.
Awesome. Okay. Yep, I'm a little, there is a delay. Okay, my name is Todd Peterson. I work for Ellis & Associates. I am just one of the members here at the, oops. I'm just one of the members here at the Open Mobility Foundation. We have been, Ellis & Associates has been doing a lot of work in Los Angeles. So a lot of what I'm going to speak about today is based on that work and some of the vision that the city has. But I am, like I said, just one voice, and there's many cities here, many different members and many different companies that are all going to have different perspectives on and where we're headed with all of this. I think we're all very excited about the possibilities. And so I think that this is just one example of the community coming together and having and sharing on what that vision might be and helping to shape it. So I'm very pleased to be here and speaking to all of you. So I'm going to go through a little bit about digital policy. I'm going to just set the stage a little bit for what it is and what it is not. But this is probably one of the more important things, is that digital policy is unlike the data specification itself, it is actually an expression from the city or from a public agency outward. So it has the power to enable outcomes that we all deeply care about, whether those are social equity outcomes, where we are able to use digital policy to affect equitable access for the services that we provide as a city or you provide as a city, or establish fairer pricing for those services. That digital policy has the power to enable those outcomes. Similarly, it also has the power to enable the environmental outcomes. So whether you choose, we'll be talking a little bit about curb management potentially, and I know that's one of the subjects that have been as very near most front and center with the Open Mobility Foundation. So that might end up meaning that the digital policy has the ability to actually prioritize access to green vehicles or green behaviors like ride sharing or other things. So it has a lot of ability that we haven't yet, that we're just beginning to explore. So how we talk about policy, I know it has a lot of different meanings for different people. It may be many of you who are DOT officials might say, I don't make policy, I just implement it. We understand that. So I just want to level set and what policy is and how we define it today in the right-of-way. And this is how we interpret our current policy maker or policy implementations, policy expressions. And so that might be these signs you'll see. Obviously, they're ubiquitous in our world right now, and they represent design of particular infrastructure, or they're solving for a safety outcome or some other outcome. But there are limitations with this expression. We've seen our world change as technology has been introduced into the world of transportation. This, is an example of how a company who had a digital presence and had a service for routing vehicles is able to route vehicles essentially anywhere, regardless of what the digital or what the physical signage might say. So because it doesn't have awareness of what kind of vehicle you're driving, it will uniformly make recommendations on where you might go to avoid traffic. And this is just one example of the problems that can cause. So part of what digital policy is giving public agencies the ability to actually express themselves in a world like this, and maybe communicate to some of these digital platforms on what the rules are, so they can be considered during, for instance, routing. I also want to talk about what is the difference, because I know we throw around this word digital a lot as well, in addition to policy. So I want to just make sure we're clear about what this is. So I will distinguish it by saying that there's a difference between digitally communicated policy and digitally expressed policy. So digitally communicated policy is what you would see here. We all use email. This is an example of an email that came from DOT with obviously the names redacted. And it was an outward expression to regulated entity or entities, and it just used plain English to express the desires of the city. In this case, digital express policy is different. It actually uses, it's still human readable, but it uses a methodology that provides a common language that could be understood and translated commonly between two parties. So that it leaves less room for interpretation. And part of what the OMF is here to do is to help us understand that common language and how the different entities interact. And so in so doing, they're machine readable and become unambiguous because of that. An example is of this here. So on the left, you'll see a plain English policy that you might recognize as something you would write on a daily basis if you're a public agency. And on the right is its digital equivalent. And so while you can still read the text, you'll see here that there's some interesting formatting, and that formatting is so machines can also read it. And that is essentially what, when we use the word API, it stands for Application Program Interface. And this is how two machines, or a machine and two machines, really talk to one another. Included in these digital policies, every policy is named. It is publishable. We use this word immutable, but it just means that once it's written, it's uneditable. So it is a source of truth. It's also like any policy, it's supersedable. So you could publish a policy that actually is applicable from a point in the past to today, and then you would able to create another policy that is applicable later on. And then within it, it contains a number of rules that have contexts within different modalities and different uses. So whether that's a measurement like count of vehicles, or has a certain threshold like a speed limit or something like that, it has a number of these features built in. Also, it has a reference to geographies. So these are the things that we understand by using maps on what defines a downtown area or a city boundary, or any number of geographic features. So those are essentially defined by a polygon, which is simply just a geometric shape that you might recognize in Google Maps. And so it's referenced also by the policy. It is also contains different elements like counts, how many vehicles would be parked, a time element, speed limits, which you might see in there. Also a description of fees, what it might cost to transact with something. And then it can be just as plain as a normal sign, a digital form of a physical sign that says something that the city might want to express to a company, and then the company could choose to forward that on to an individual users if they chose to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about today, tomorrow, and in the future, now that we've kind of defined what policy is. And so you're going to hear a lot about today. You're going to hear from Jarvis, and he's going to talk a lot about how digital policy is being used in the context of dockless mobility, which is how we kind of got here, and how it's being used to dynamically express fleet caps, how it's being used to validate data, and also just deal with planned events like cyclovia. You'll probably hear from others as well. They're talking about these very things in different contexts and with different experiences. So it's going to be really valuable to hear. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about tomorrow. These are tomorrow and in the future. These are simply just one person's thoughts. You're going to hear a lot today, like I said before, about what tomorrow and the future brings based on different perspectives. So an example of what's happening today, what you'll hear is we're using policy to balance services. So, for micromobility, for instance, you might choose to have a policy that is serving a social equity need. So for instance, this states in the lower right-hand corner, an underserved area in a hypothetical geography where the city can express a need for 1,000 additional vehicles. And that would be to serve a need that was specific to a particular agency. Likewise, you could specify different levels of vehicles in different geographies with that same type of policy. But like Yasha mentioned, this is just a kit of parts. Digital policy on its own can be used as a flat file that you could email. But it can also be used in conjunction with a number of other really valuable elements. So it can combine with a compliance engine where you use the MDS, one of the MDS data ingestion APIs to measure what's happening and then compare that against what the policy was. And then you can generate reports and compliance measurements that state essentially how things are going in real time without deploying hundreds or thousands of people that would otherwise be required to do that. And just a few things about what sort of digital policy is. So as you kind of learn here, it's part of MDS. It's just one of the parts in the kit. It's definitely different than data sharing, where data sharing is ingesting data. Digital policy is the opposite of that. It's being expressed from an agency outward. It is digital, but it's still readable by humans. And it is able to mirror what we've seen, the written language that you would write today, but it's also capable of doing much more than that, which we'll see here in a minute. And then, and it's also it's complemented by other things that are inside of the Open Mobility Foundation and part of MDS. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on tomorrow and in the future, and I'm going to do so hopefully in a very non-technical way, and just to describe it and kind of bring home how all this might work. So really what policy tomorrow has the potential to bring to all of us is the ability for new types of PPPs where private entities, like the ones you see here, the logos that are actually in the OMF right now, and maybe some future ones that we could think about as providing freight services at the curb, and many others that I didn't list here that are currently members and potential members. But it's a way for us to express policy to these types of entities and let those policies be reflected in the services that they might provide to private users or occupational users. And it could be just as simple as, like I said, as a message or a sign, or it could be as complicated as governing a particular transaction at a curb or something else. And just to illustrate how this might work and bringing it home, I put together this example of how policy would be used in curb management. This is not something that's necessarily happening right now. It's just a possibility as a way of casting the future. So this is an example of Ayana. She lives in downtown Los Angeles, and she's buying a product from a website, like I'm sure we've done many, many times over the last 6 months, all of us. And in this case, an electric vehicle was deployed to pick up Ayana's order from the warehouse and deliver to her place of residence. In the process here, there are things going on though. On the lower right hand, or in the lower section, you'll see that the city council of this particular city, Los Angeles, has been making some policies that really promote the use of green technology. And that's being done as a part of a Green Deal or something like that. And as a response to that, a DOT official, maybe like Jarvis, that you'll hear from in a second, could actually create a policy in MDS that allows it to prioritize electric vehicle usage at the curb. This would be used when the shipper actually requests a curb space, for instance. The system that would be running behind this, that could be provided by one of the vendors in the OMF or somebody else, or the city itself, would basically respond to that request with an acceptance. And it would know that it was an electric vehicle and would be able to prioritize or maybe use one of the designated electric vehicle delivery spaces. It's predetermined. The outcome from this is that, Ayana is obviously happy that her package arrived, but just as importantly to that, the city was able to promote use of green technology in this case, assuming that electric vehicles were green, and be able to reward, and also the freight operator was able to be rewarded for that investment. So just one example, there are hundreds and thousands of other ones that we have yet to be discovered. But this also has implications in the future as well, and I'll quickly go over it. If you can imagine a world where the world's filled with drones, I know that's been a conversation, but I'm just going to take us all the way to that point. Digital policy, if you were to imagine that world, would be used in a context that is very similar. So we are actually actively working with the federal agencies on something similar to this, but essentially we have to determine, cities do, where drones will land and take off through land use policy making. If that land use policy was actually a digital one, we would be able to determine where acceptable places, where the acceptable places were to take off and land, and with what type of vehicle. When you combine that with an MDS technology that could exist in the future and a permitting scheme, it might look like something like this. And this is my last slide. So same process. Ayana buying a product. Obviously the retailer is using an aerial vehicle to deliver this time. In the lower right-hand corner, very similar, the mayor issues a policy that prioritizes UAM infrastructure, and the DOT official in this case is using digital policy to determine, through a planning lens, acceptable places to land and take off. In the upper box, you'll notice that there was a Class A vehicle there, which means it was a quiet vehicle, it was a clean vehicle. And that company knows it was okay to land in this particular area because of the digital policy that the city agency issued. So when those are combined, again, at the end of the day, the shipper was happy, and the city was ensured that the package arrived without disrupting its neighbors, in a green way, or whatever the policy is that they decide is appropriate. So again, nothing that is necessarily happening right now, but just to give you a view into what could happen in the future. So that is all I had for you today, so I can hand it over to Mr. Jarvis Murray.
All right, thank you, Todd. And thank you everyone for allowing me to be here today and giving me an excuse to put on a tie. I just want to make sure that I can move the slides here. There we go. Now, I'm with the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, run by the fabulous Salita Reynolds. And I'm going to talk to you today about how we in Los Angeles are using the MDS and the policy APIs. My role at the LADOT is that I manage all the permitting for hire vehicles, and that includes taxis, non-emergency medical, some shuttles, and I also manage our dockless program at the LADOT. So we do have some experience in using the MDS program. But one of the things I want to start off with before I even kind of launch into our presentation here is I want to take everyone back to the golden days of working for a city. And I haven't been with cities very long. I began my career in a public sector about 11 years ago. But even then, 11 years ago, oftentimes we were still trying to find ways to express policies to our permittees. And so a good example is I was working in the city of San Francisco back then. And we had a very strong wheelchair accessible program for our taxis and our paratransit. And one of the issues that we had is that we have this policy of a certain number of pickups, a certain percentage of pickups, but we couldn't actually always verify what was happening, if it was happening or anything. And this is also a time where we're not even collecting any real data. So what we were doing in those days is that we were going outside, pen and paper, in the San Francisco summertime, which meant it was foggy and 55 degrees, standing on street corners and calling. We were calling various companies and seeing who would pick up. And we were writing it down, noting, okay, well, yellow cab, we called them 10 times and we had 9 pickups, or we had 0 pickups, and we would go back to our offices, put down an Excel spreadsheet, and then have an indication of, okay, well, this is what it's looking like right now. We have this policy, but we're only fulfilling 10% of our goals. And this is the way that we used to manage policy back in those days. And part of what MDS has done for us in Los Angeles is rather than putting out a policy and then hoping that it works, we're actually able to get out there, audit, verify, whether it's on the ground or digitally, that is actually happening. So to talk about some of the things that we've worked with. So this is an example here of just a non-regular day. And this was ridership in the Hollywood area at this time. This was sometime about a year or more ago, probably about a year and a half ago. And this was the ridership at the time. We were preparing for what we call ciclovia. And for those of you who don't know, ciclovia is this kind of day where you shut down some of the main streets, some of the larger streets in your city, and you make them just available for pedestrians and bicyclists. And everyone goes out and it's a fun time for everybody. But there are no motorized vehicles, in ciclovia, so no cars. And also, in this situation, there'd be no, electric scooters being able to roll through ciclovia. So we expressed the policy, we sent an email out, but we didn't at this time really express it in a way that was easy for the providers to understand or to work with. So consequently, what ended up happening was when ciclovia, the day did come, there was essentially no change. And so what we realized then was, okay, if we're gonna manage this and do this properly, we need to find a better way to communicate with our providers. And that began with us creating essentially a digital policy workflow. And essentially what this meant was, we weren't just gonna email the providers and hope that they understood what was gonna happen, but we actually worked on crafting the right boundaries, putting together the maps, communicating with the providers, and then creating a sandbox where they can kind of play around in it and see what works, what doesn't work, and give us feedback on what's happening. And then when we finally have everything ready, then we could publish the policy, and then we had a stronger chance of it actually working. So one of the positive outcomes we had was this. So as you can see in the far left, we have saturation. This is Sunday, May 5th of 2019 in our Venice Beach area. Now Venice, you see all the ridership in the left-hand square, the left square furthest to your left. and it's busy. It's one of our highest utilized areas in Los Angeles for scooter ridership. And obviously, believe it or not, that area is filled with residents. So there's a whole lot of residents who are living in this and going, you know, this is too much. And, you know, they're contacting the city and trying to figure out, how do we fix this? What's going on? And so we try to figure out, okay, well, what do we need to actually solve for? And we wanted to solve for the saturation, the over deployment, and find a way to make sure that everyone can still operate in Venice, but not make it so that the neighbors are so heavily impacted that you can barely walk out your door without stumbling over a scooter. And so we did that by creating this digital policy. And again, as Todd mentioned, it's really about the digital expression, and I think of it as more like communication with the providers directly to indicate for the providers and their systems what it is that we, the LADOT, needs to happen. And so the outcome of this is after May, you know, we began entering the policy, everyone began using it, and if you see the square on your far right there, the outcome is that the saturation decreased tremendously. You know, we made rules essentially about the number of devices that can be on a particular block base. So it was 5 per company per block. We had a certain number that you could only have at that time. So I think about 150 per provider in the whole area. And that's what worked to give everyone a sense of, and to give the neighbors peace of mind. And for those of us in the cities, kind of the most important part of that is the bottom graph you see. It's the My LA 301 service requests. And these service requests where everyone can call 311 and say, hey, I have a problem. And these are from the Venice area. So as you see in May, we had about 837 complaints and service requests dealing with scooters in that area. But as we implement the policy in June, the complaints began to decrease. And by July, and July being really at that time our busiest, one of our busiest months of the year for scooter ridership, the complaints were decreased down to 500. And by September, which is the picture you see on the right, we were down to 328 complaints for that month related to scooters in the area. So we reduced the number of complaints by more than half by simply being able to express the policy digitally in a way that not just, you know, the provider and the layman can understand, because we have our layman policy and what we're trying to accomplish, what we're trying to understand, but we also had a policy that digitally the systems could recognize and were able to work through. Because really, you're really trying to figure out what is it that you're trying to solve. The next one here is we did something similar here in Hollywood. So the kind of shaded area you see on the graph here is the Hollywood Walk of Fame area. So these are all the stars you walk up and down, and you can see the golden era of Hollywood up and down the street. And this is that entire area, Hollywood Boulevard, and then the kind of shorter up and down is Vine Street, where you also have some of the stars. So at this time, again, we're having an issue. You see the ridership along Hollywood, and again, this is one of our busy ridership areas. But this is the Hollywood Walk of Fame. One, it's a historical monument. So the sidewalk itself is considered a historical monument. And this is basically scooters riding along the sidewalk. And two, the Business Improvement District, they came out and they contacted us and said, hey, listen, we have all these scooters on our sidewalk. We're having to pick them up and move them. You know, they claim that they have been moving up to 2,000 scooters a month, you know, just to move them out from their doorways. And the Walk of Fame, if any of you have ever visited, it's not an area where you just walk and walk. Everyone tends to stop when they see their favorite star or whomever, and you know, they stop, they take pictures, they want to take pictures of themselves, you know, standing with their favorite star. And so it's really not an area that's meant for a device to move 15 miles an hour where people are going to be constantly starting and stopping on their walk. So they reached out and said, what can we do? And again, we tested this out with our providers. We sent a policy indicating what do we need in this area and the problems that we're having. And the policy is essentially for us, no starting and no stopping in the area, as well as no rolling through the area. So what that basically means that once you enter the area, we were basically requiring the devices to stop, to cruise down to 0 miles an hour. And so that's what we began in June. And by July, as you see in the bottom half, it cleaned it up dramatically. And again, this was an improvement for the businesses. This was an improvement for, you know, the council district, the council person in that area. And this was really a great win for everyone involved. And it's been very helpful to have it go this way. So what is it exactly that we're seeing? Through MDS, we're able to see a whole lot of different behaviors. We're able to see device deployment, devices being removed from the right of way when it's being locked and unlocked, and basically any, you know, device status change. And this is something that we expect to do on multiple nodes. So, you know, dockless for us is just the tip of the iceberg. We are actually expanding these modes onto taxis as we speak, and we'll be expanding it to all of our other modes in the future. So taxis are legacy mode, but we're also looking at future modes, and that includes moped share, which may be coming down for us in the future, as well as potentially urban air mobility or autonomous vehicles. And even with taxis, as we work through what the states are going to look like, we're looking at having a notification of a reserve state. So when a car has been called or reserved through an app or by telephone, start trips, end trips, available, not unavailable. So we're looking at a host of different things that we're going to be managing in the taxi space. And so as we work through the outcomes, our suggestion to you is essentially, for those of you who begin these programs, when you're beginning a policy program and you're starting the policy API implementation, it's really important that you work with your providers on what you're doing. So really, it's going to be kind of three things. One, you're going to kind of start and test your policy. Two, you're going to meet with your providers. So as you begin testing the policy and you're seeing things that are going on, you know, when you see different problems or things that are not satisfying the outcome that you were wanting or hoping for, you reach out to the company and you figure out what the problem is. Is it an issue with the rule? Is it an issue with the technology? And then you work those pieces out, you kind of make adjustments, and then you begin monitoring that behavior and keeping them in the loop on what's going on. And then once you kind of get that down, then you can kind of begin the ongoing process of working with the city and the providers. And again, communication is key with your providers. And then at that point, you can really begin to manage compliance, because as a city, you also have to manage compliance with your providers. And so what we are going to be doing in Los Angeles is we're going to be doing basically monthly reports with our providers, each individually, and showing them, you know, where there were issues, where there were violations of our Geo Fences, of our special operations zones. And by the way, that's what we call the areas of Venice and Hollywood. We call them special operations zones because we created Geo Fences in those areas where that activity, we can work on creating the outcomes and incentivizing the behavior that we think is necessary in that area. But then you can begin measuring outcomes later on. So what MDS has allowed us to do, and what allows a lot of people to do, is essentially to have a permitting program without the main things that you typically use. And this is some of the lessons you learn when you're working with, for instance, a legacy program like taxis. So using MDS, you don't need to actually have an RFP where you have to pre-select mobility providers. You can just have a permitting program like we did that essentially says you meet this criteria, you can join. It's not as important, you know, it's up to the city, but you don't necessarily have to have a cap, because now, regardless of where they are in your jurisdiction, you'll be able to monitor and work with the devices in your right of way. And you don't have to worry about a distinct geographic limitation, because, you know, sometimes some cities have to begin piloting programs, you know, okay, well, we'll start it in the downtown area and then we'll watch it from there. And a lot of that has to do with being essentially unable to control for outcomes throughout your entire city. The taxi world, you know, in the old days, this is exactly what they did. And these are the lessons that, you know, we're trying to ensure that scooter providers and future modes don't have to end up doing. In the old taxi world, you had a franchise system or a medallion system that purposefully created caps so that you didn't have more than you could manage in a particular city. And this created a lot of scarcity and, frankly, a lot of, you know, it wasn't a great system. And now for us, as we move these onto taxis, we're no longer requiring a franchise system. We're having a permitting system. Number of companies, not important. vehicle caps. Every taxi city has essentially a vehicle cap, or franchise cap, a medallion cap. We're no longer having to worry about the number of vehicles on the street anymore. We can actually monitor them through this system. And that's kind of one of the big important things for us. Again, we're going to be extending the MDS onto these modes: taxis, urban air mobilities. We're looking at, working with our airports, autonomous vehicles, and a lot of this are different ways to help us manage our assets. We're going to be managing our curb space, our streets, and again, even the airspace we can look to manage. And a lot of the outcomes that we're really looking at, we're managing kind of emissions, we're using social equity, and again, equity is a big piece for us in Los Angeles. We're going to be using the MDS platform. We created what we call mobility equity zones, mobility disadvantage zones throughout the city of Los Angeles. And we're going to be using that. We have the files, we have the Geo Json, essentially kind of these geo fenced areas where we're going to incentivize use in those areas. So one of those things is, for example, Venice being one of our highest utilization areas. We're saying if you want to deploy in Venice, you're going to have a certain percentage of your fleet in what we consider an equity zone. And we have a map that's enabled for our providers to use. And now, rather than going out there and standing on a street corner and trying to figure out, is it really happening, or sending an email and praying that it happens, we can actually look through the system and begin managing, okay, this is the number of vehicles and devices that should be in that area. And we're doing the same with taxis. Taxis have always had a social equity component, whether it's through wheelchair accessible vehicles or through serving underserved areas. And now, rather than relying on self-reported data, I can go back and rely on what we're actually seeing versus, what used to happen with us going out and writing and doing these different things. And we're able to manage the curb space. We will be doing trip fees along with that. So we'll be doing trip fees for our dockless devices and trip fees based upon geography. So again, higher utilization area, higher trip fee, underutilized area or underserved area, lower trip fees. We even considered dwell time. And while we're not doing dwell time now, that's something that we're considering on our taxis in terms of where they're using curb space. So if you have an EV taxi and you're dwelling on the curb space, maybe we have a lesser charge for you than we would, say, a gas-powered vehicle or a wheelchair accessible vehicle. So we're able to do things like that. And part of that dynamic management, and this is my last slide here, but part of that management is that we'll be able to express the policy. You're going to have this curb state where you can make reservations. Again, you can have EVs on the curb. You can have wheelchair accessible vehicles on the curb. You can price your curb dynamically based upon that. You can have equity oriented pricing, which essentially is really about, again, better pricing for EVs, wheelchair accessible vehicles, or incentivizing service in particular areas. Maybe you say, if you serve this area, we can give you better access to the airport. And then the last one being the airport. The airport you can use for dynamic pickup areas. Airports are always managing their curb space or their lots. You can expand and contract services based upon the demand you experience at the airport. So a lot of these things can occur through MDS. And for us, and for me, I still have staff, I have investigators that go out on the street. We still are able to go out and do audits. And it's an important component of what we do. But rather than just relying solely on field audits and people out there doing kind of the pen and the paper, the MDS, and the policy APIs have allowed us to not just collect the data, but push the policy and be able to see, regardless of whether we have 36,000 scooters on the road, that we can see if the policy and if the outcomes are actually being met without having to stand out there and hire hundreds of people to do it by pen and paper. And really, one of the best things for us is that MDS and the policy API has allowed us to have this kind of sky's the limit philosophy in terms of what we do, whether it's autonomous vehicles, urban air mobility. But regardless of whether the sky being the limit or how many modes we have, whether it's legacy or future modes, having a tool like this prevents us from essentially being overwhelmed. And that's been the benefit for us in the city of Los Angeles. And so thank you. And obviously you guys can have questions and we'll talk to them at the end of the schedule. But I will turn it over to the next person who is with Stae.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jarvis. I just want to make sure I can control the screen here. Okay, we are good. First of all, thank you all so much for joining today. And thanks especially to Jarvis and Todd for doing such a deep technical dive into your implementation. I'm really excited to show you a little bit of what we've been working on with the city of Louisville in Kentucky. My name is Joe Gurton. I am head of growth at Stae. It feels like I've been working with MDS for kind of a long time now. I know, the total lifespan of MDS is only a couple of years at this point, but in a past life, I worked on MDS implementations with other OMF members on the public side while I was at Ride Report. And now at Stae, I've been working on our sort of MDS policy implementation. I think it's been a great learning experience for me personally implementing MDS policy with Louisville. It's also been a really interesting learning experience for our company as a whole. So thank you so much to Yasha, to Angela, and Michael at the OMF for getting us together to talk about it. In a little bit, I'm going to turn it over to James Graham from the city of Louisville to give you some context on the city side. Then my colleague Brooke McKim, who will talk through the technical details of how we implemented with the city. I just want to apologize in advance for how much of a manual our presentation is. We really tried to avoid that as best we could. And I just want to own that failure on behalf of our team. I know how white and male the transportation planning and GovTech spaces can be. And we're really thinking every day at Stae about how to better represent the communities that we work for. Our mission at Stae is to really make civic data in general more actionable, more automated, and more portable, both within organizations and to the public. So mobility data is just one of the verticals we work in. We touch AV shuttle programs, we touch transit fare card data, in addition to the micromobility work that we do. Overall, we help agencies create better policy analysis and reporting workflows, trying to improve outcomes across the board, both from mobility management to affordable housing grant reporting, and even to budget analysis at the municipal and county levels. We're essentially a two-way API layer for civic data. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to James Graham from the city of Louisville to give us a bit of background on where the city started off with shared mobility.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I'm going to leave the PowerPoint in your hands for the sake of bandwidth. Anyway, thanks everyone for being here. I'm James. I'm with the city of Louisville. I'm the mobility coordinator for Louisville Metro Public Works. One of my many jobs is to manage the shared dockless micromobility program here in Louisville. I'm a team of one, and I also oversee some grants and other bike and pedestrian related programs in the city. For the last 18 months or so, though, I and the city have been working with Stae to take a data-driven approach to managing our program. When we brought micromobility to Louisville, we wanted to be transparent, equity-driven, and responsive to Louisville residents in managing the program. So we did our best to respond to concerns from the start. From the beginning, the dockless vehicle program here in Louisville, we aim to address safety and compliance at the system level rather than imposing enforcement on the users. Currently, our team within Public Works is making a push for Louisville Metro to join the Vision Zero network. And as part of that, we certainly recognize that enforcement of traffic laws has in a lot of ways has been and remains ineffective. And unfortunately, as we've seen, problematic, especially for people of color. Part of our enforcement at the system level has been coming up with digital enforcement zones for no ride, no parking, and slow ride zones, specifying speed limits and vehicle caps in certain areas. At first, how we implemented that and enforced compliance was pretty manual, and I'll talk a little bit about how we iterated on that. Go to the next slide. So I want to walk through some of the specific policies and practices. We have focused our policy implementation on public safety. Fleet caps, speed limits, and no ride zones for our micromobility operators were one of the ways we did this. No ride zones were really focused on safety of vulnerable communities. One example of that here in Louisville is our Louisville School and Printing House for the Blind in our Clifton neighborhood, which understandably had concerns about scooter ridership in their neighborhood. So we implemented a no ride zone around their campus to make sure it was clear to riders that this area was off limits. Also, the downtown core is very dense, and we did end up having a couple incidents of on-sidewalk scooter riding, which is prohibited here in Louisville, which led to collisions between pedestrians. So we implemented a slow zone downtown for the time being until we can improve the infrastructure for our scooters to ease those conflicts. And we wanted to be able to tweak these areas and speed limits from time to time and adjust fleet cap size as the program evolved and as we received feedback from the community. So early on, when we were implementing these policies, I would focus enforcement mostly in reaction to public complaints. A lot of the solutions that you'll see in a second, our Geo Fences were developed, were complaint driven. Being a team of one, it's sometimes difficult to be proactive. But in the beginning, this was largely how we were developing our policies in the program. I would occasionally go out and test vehicles in the field to see if they were complying with these restrictions. Again, I'm a team of one, so I'm overseeing the program, but also having to go out there when we were rolling out updates to the policy to see whether or not operators were in compliance. It was a lot of work, and there was too much of a lag in evaluating compliance with some of these policies that need to be implemented in real time. To walk you through a little bit of the workflow and how we manage this, initially I just emailed the operators GIS shapefiles for them to incorporate and update in their backends. Then we'd start trying to standardize the process. I uploaded shapefiles for distribution zones or no ride zones and fleet caps to our city's open data portal. Then we'd email the operators with a link to the updated file. And I track all of this through a Google Sheet. We'd then contact our operators. They would download and implement the new policy. There wasn't really a feedback loop to confirm that they had updated the policy on their end. And I'd have to update our evaluation metrics in Stae separately to see whether operators and riders were complying. This was pretty frustrating for our operators, understandably. We really want to make it easier for operators to see Louisville as a positive market so that both entities can achieve their goals for the program, and all this back and forth about updated policies is extra work for them too. And also, because I have a GIS background and operators are often more familiar with APIs as a data environment, we sometimes talk past each other. So on the next slide, yeah, you'll see these are some of our Geo Fences that we have set up top. In red is our no ride zones, which includes the area surrounding the printing house and school for the blind on the right. In the middle in green, you see our no parking, which includes the printing house for the blind as well as our waterfront park. And then in yellow is our speed reduced zones, which include the central business district, as I mentioned, where there was a lot of concerns between pedestrians and scooter conflicts, as well as the University of Louisville. So talk a little bit challenges. I have to think about policy updates on a really limited bandwidth. I do have a lot going on. It's critical for me to have real-time visibility into policy issues to protect our most vulnerable populations, like the community around the School for the Blind. The way we were doing things, it really wasn't a level playing field. For updating policy for operators, I'd upload a new shapefile to the open data portal, email each operator separately to alert them and ask them to download. Operators were implementing at different times, so a user might have a different experience based on their chosen operator, and the tendency to go back and forth between them was causing some confusion for our residents. It was extra work for everyone to email each operator, and my team had no way of knowing if and when operators had updated policies. However, I want to talk about some of the progress we've made with the policy API. Stae built a new automated backend on top of my existing processes. The Stae team built an integration with my existing workflow, which my colleagues already use to understand what our latest policies are. When I publish new geospatial files like digital enforcement zones to the open data portal, or add new cap or speed policies in the Google Sheet, Stae automatically scrapes that update and makes the new policy available to operators. I didn't really have to change anything about how I was working, and when the API standard changes or new APIs replace policy, I won't have to adjust. So now I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Brooke with Stae to talk about how we implemented some of this.
Yeah, thank you, James. I'm going to first just give a brief overview of what our product does in general, talk about how we've been working with Louisville prior to the policy API, and then kind of the lightweight iterative process we use to implement the policy API into James's existing workflow. So just a general overview of our product. We offer a cloud-based SaaS solution, which core feature set helps agencies automate data aggregation, reporting, and analysis. And as Joe mentioned, we do this across a variety of use cases, not just constrained to micromobility. And also a core feature set here is being able to pull data via an API into our system, but also publish the data that's in the system via APIs. And so, as you can see, there's some screenshots from our product on the right side of the slide to show what James was doing in our product prior to the policy API. We pull in data via what's called the provider API, and has been mentioned multiple times in this presentation already. It was things like trips, drop-offs, pickups, anytime an operator would rebalance a scooter, and that's what you can actually see. We have a rebalance dashboard set up for James where he's able to see which operators are rebalancing scooters in what neighborhoods, and is that meeting his equity requirements. And we were really excited when the MDS policy API was published because it was a chance to take this source of data we already had in the product and start to publish it in a specific manner to vendors. So to talk a little bit about the lightweight way we decided to actually implement this, and the goal was to really leverage existing features of our platform and leverage James's existing workflow, so not a ton had to change. And one of the main challenges here is what Todd touched on earlier in the presentation, is how do you take that human readable policy that was maybe sent in an email and turn it into this new machine readable policy, which is great for machines, but asking a program manager to understand what every field means or what the structure of the API is supposed to be is pretty tough. And so we turned to our old friend, the spreadsheet. And since our system can pull data from flat files or spreadsheets or APIs, James just has to know a couple fields in the spreadsheet and fill in a couple columns. And then we ingest that into our system. And along with that, we're pulling the shape files from his already published, the published files on the GIS instance. And we pull that into our system. And now we have these shared vehicle restrictions in our system, which then on top of that, we have an integration which will publish that data as an MDS compliant API. And so it was really great to leverage all these existing workflows and existing feature set. James didn't really have to wait for us to develop a specific UI for him to enter policies or modify policies. And also, we know that OMF is moving fairly quickly. There's changes being made to the spec and it's evolving. And so we wanted to make sure we could keep up with those changes by just keeping the process as lightweight as possible. And to kind of put a bow on this, it's not only having this data in our system that makes it possible to publish the API, but James is also able to do reporting on these policies or bring in test policies into our system and maybe look back through history and see how many times that policy would have resulted in non-compliance. But he's also able to ensure that the reporting he's doing matches the policies which are being published to the operator, which is super powerful and wasn't necessarily the case before. Here you can see a screenshot, just some, again, a dashboard that James has set up to see some parking non-compliance. And he also has automated email reports come from our system. The one in the screenshot is kind of a historical looking back on the month, but we have some more proactive ones that as soon as that data comes in about scooters being dropped off, especially with the School for the Blind, James is able to get a report and potentially actually send someone out and pick a scooter up. So you can head to the next slide. And just to talk a little bit where we are now and kind of what we think we've accomplished, definitely less ambiguity in the policy communication, a simplified workflow, although I will say we kind of set off in this endeavor at the beginning of the year, and our next step was start to engage operators and understand their needs around how communication needed to work and how frequently policies were going to change. And unfortunately, COVID hit, and so scooter usage dropped off for a while, but now it's been beginning to pick up again in Louisville, and so we're ready to re-engage with the operators to put this to use. However, it kind of shows the power of OMF and the development of a specification, in that we were able to make progress on complying with this spec before even engaging with an operator. And now operators are also able to look at that specification and know what they're getting when they implement the policies that Louisville is publishing. And so it was just really cool to be able to know what we were working towards and have that codified in the specification.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brooke. And I just was actually thinking about Jarvis mentioning how LADOT has used 311 complaints as sort of a gauge of whether these policy interventions are working and if we're actually sort of actively responding to what the public needs in real time. Something that we sort of naturally integrate with the Stae Civic Intelligence platform is 311 data in a variety of cities. So something that one of our micromobility city partners could do is essentially overlay 311 complaints on this kind of spatial data and say, okay, you know, we changed policy in this part of town on July 7th. How did 311 complaints get affected after that? So I think in terms of what we're taking away generally from our implementation of MDS policy, a few things. I think we saw how important it was to design a workflow that fit really well with what James and his colleagues at the city were already doing, the city processes they're already using, and really build something that works consistently for the multiple stakeholders that rely on it. This is a new thing, and testing it really does require getting a lot of buy-in from everyone who's touching this. We also learned that there are a lot of potential implementations for the policy API and generally API layers at our partner agencies. I'm gonna talk more about that in a little bit. I think that, you know, adapting with API changes is sort of the part of the process here. We know that, you know, as an OMF member ourselves, MDS is a living standard. New mobility modes and city reporting workflows and management needs are changing super rapidly. You know, we anticipate that MDS policy will change and birth new sub-APIs, and we expect to be able to adapt to that really, really quickly. And we can accommodate changes in the standards super easily and bring in new stakeholders really seamlessly. So our main takeaway was that having this kind of API layer to facilitate that push-pull communication between the city of Louisville and micromobility operators, that's super attractive. And that has a lot of other implementations. Really, if you think about it, there are a lot of other sort of government, private sector relationships that can use the kind of common language that we've developed with MDS, and that this API specifically provides to really tie together data sources, broadcast consistent info and policy in a digital format back to partners, whether that's providers in the private sector, or that's other departments internally, and even automate reporting workflows for other department stakeholders. So to speak really specifically about how we're sort of already doing that and tying those different data sources and data needs together, the Stae approach really focuses on data interoperability, standardization, and portability across all verticals, internal or external. So there's so many use cases where we think it's helpful for a city or another government agency to communicate a real-time standardized source of truth to vendors, to operators, or even to internal partners and other agencies. A great example of how we've helped another agency with that, we've supported a state DOT that's running an AV shuttle pilot that involved essentially developing a reporting workflow for those government staff to understand how this new mode was operating in the public right of way. That's one potential arena. We're doing a different project that's focused on supporting a transit agency's performance improvement plan. That's involving ingesting a lot of disparate APIs from a lot of different sources and different formats to essentially produce better reporting for that DOT's leadership and for the Federal Transit Administration. And I know personally from participating in the curb management working group here at the OMF, how critical it's going to be to have a single source of digital truth to communicate curb and street use policy to delivery and freight providers that are managing their own workflows. So really having a simple API layer that I think turns mobility and policy data and really the mishmash of current business and database systems that our public agency partners use into a coherent push-pull API platform. We think that's really critical to developing the kinds of modern lightweight workflows that DOTs are looking for. To that end, we've moved beyond these mobility specific use cases, and we're developing those workflows for everything from affordable housing reporting to budget transparency and resilience planning and a bunch of other verticals I'd be happy to talk about. All these verticals, they essentially need an operating system that can publish that data back out to create analytics and reporting and really engage other stakeholders and other tools, whether that's business intelligence platforms, elected officials, commercial partners, and even the public through open data portals. So I want to just thank everyone so much for coming. Please reach out if you have any questions. If you are curious about what we do and the work that we did with the city of Louisville, I've published a companion blog post to this webinar. You can find it on our Medium blog, which is called City as a Service. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out over email. Be happy to talk more. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, everybody. My name is Jacob Sherman. I work at the Portland Bureau of Transportation, here presenting with Dana from Ride Report on some of the work that we've been doing together, which really, I think, builds on a lot of the conversation we've had today, both in terms of what LADOT is doing in Louisville and some of our work. So want to talk through some of the work that we've been doing, and recognizing we're running low on time, and it would be great to be able to have a little bit of a conversation. I think that the policy API has been a kind of a great opportunity for us to solve some of the challenges that I think we and other cities have faced. I think, you know, with MDS, we've realized that sometimes there can be a lack of clarity in what the data means. As Joe said, you know, often there isn't a single source of truth, and there could be a lot of variability between what an operator's internal data feed is saying versus what the data the city might be receiving directly from the operator is saying versus the data that a third-party platform like a Ride Report or a Stae might also have. And that can create a lot of challenges from a regulatory perspective in terms of having multiple different truths out there. It makes it very challenging to regulate new mobility in the digital age when there aren't some of these foundational definitions. Some of the other kind of current shortcomings with MDS around provider and agency is also kind of an ability to calculate fees and surcharges, which is one of the things that I think cities recognize as really important for being able to support micromobility programs, as well as ideally generate resources that can be used to benefit micromobility in the long run. So with that in mind, we've really seen the opportunity policy API to develop solutions to those challenges. We've been working with Ride Report to try and ensure that cities and operators can have a kind of a shared truth and develop a common language about our performance, to create the ability for data-driven regulation, and to kind of, as others have, I think, really suggested, make sure that our rules are clear in a machine-readable way. One of the things that we did early on in some of the work with Ride Report was actually took some of our administrative rules and started to kind of publish them in GitHub. And now we're starting to kind of operationalize that. And as others have, I think, said, you know, if you can't have that rule in some sort of machine readable format, then that might be problematic. And I think that was one of the things that we've found in some of our own rules. So working together with Ride Report, we've been defining some of our administrative rules in GitHub, particularly some of the elements around kind of metrics and some of the fees. We've been then, Ride Report has been working to kind of express those rules via MDS policy inside of Ride Report. And we're starting to make those policies available to providers so that we can then start to measure performance and compliance based on those policies. So I'm going to hand it over to Dana to take from here.
Thanks, Jacob. Just making sure everyone can hear me okay. Thumbs up, Jacob. Perfect. Okay. So yeah, my name is Dana Backrack. I work at Ride Report. We provide tools for micromobility and shared mobility planning to cities. One is PBOT. A couple other of our cities are on the line, including Austin and Municipality, DRCOG. And I have to give a shout out to Brian Rule from Adelaide. It's almost 4 a.m. his time. So thank you for joining so early in the morning. So I'll talk a little bit about our process for building successful policy API tools. The first that we're really focused on, which LADOT mentioned, was getting buy-in from stakeholders before developing the truly technical features. I'll speak a little bit more to that. Building helpful foundational features first, and then getting continuous feedback before overall deployment. Next slide.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. One of the first ways we're focused on getting buy-in from the operator partners is we provide the operators their own dashboard free of charge. This is to help them find alignment between ride report, the city or municipality, and the operators, and make sure that we're developing a single source of truth and a reliable place for data management. The screenshot you're seeing here is of our data health feature. Teo is a fake operator. This is our demo dashboard. And it says no issues found right here. It would surface a red or yellow flag if any issues were found, and then it would actually show you the expression of the issue, such as no vehicle IDs coming through the MDS feed. And again, this is working towards finding alignment and reliability of our data and data trustworthiness. Next slide. Working from that, as I mentioned, building those foundational tools first. So we're building policy API supportive features. Again, here's a screenshot from our demo dashboard where you're seeing a zone, priority area 2. For example, this could be, you know, the Venice Beach zone or a downtown zone or an equity zone. In Portland, that might be the east side. And up in the right-hand corner, you'll see the download Geo Json file. This is so that operators can actually download the Geo Json of zones themselves. It helps with version control and change management, and I think helps cities in general make sure that there's one source of truth versus multiple emails going around, as you've heard mentioned. This report tab will also be where operators and cities can go to see how they're doing in terms of cap management in different zones and align on metrics across the board. And then again, as I mentioned, getting continuous feedback and iterating. So this is a look at our policy page in the ride report dashboard. This is still in development, but we're quite excited about it. So right here, we're expressing a policy, which is the 25-cent per trip fee for Portland city limits. And this enables Portland to track trips that are happening within Portland city limits and multiply that number of trips by the per trip fee. So we're using this as an early test case, which will then be used in iterative fashion for more policy expressions. Next slide. So kind of building on that fees example, here you'll see in the back is actually an invoice you can print from our dashboard that cities, municipalities can send directly to the operators. And then building from that 25-cent for Portland city limits, for the central city limits, as you'll see here, we're building in right now the fees for other areas, East Portland being a lower equity zone, so 5-cent per trip fee, and then a 10-cent for other areas within the Portland zone. In general, Ride Report's goal is to have Ride Report be this single source of truth for policies. So instead of Jacob or PBOT needing to publish their administrative rules, email them out, potentially have them, you know, in multiple different places, they're able to be expressed solely on Ride Report. Operators and all other stakeholders, not solely, but main source on Ride Report, can go to Ride Report as their source of information. And eventually, down the line, there is a desire to have more dynamic governments so that PBOT and other cities can dynamically manage policies. Of course, this is going to require operator buy-in. A policy needs to actually be implemented on the ground. It's not just a number on the dashboard. And so we're very focused on getting, as I mentioned, buy-in from all stakeholders involved. So yeah, thank you for everyone for their time. Apologies, that was a little rushed, but we're very open to Q&A.
All right. Thank you so much. That was really awesome. apologize for the truncated Q&A portion, but we are ready to dive in. So please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A. I'm going to go ahead actually and stop sharing my screen while we dive in. Okay. And by the way, my name is Angela. I'm our member engagement manager here at the Open Mobility Foundation. And I'm going to be helping moderate the Q&A. Also, for any of the questions that we don't get to, please feel free to ask them. We're going to catalog them and hope to answer them all offline via a blog post or other resources. So the first question that I want to turn our attention to is from Andrea or Andrea. And I think this one might be a good fit for Jarvis to kind of answer first. So the question is, if a municipality imposes a fee to charge per ride, what are the parameters that go into defining a trip? That is a trip just when a device is activated and then deactivated, even if the distance is 0? Or is it when there has been some minimum distance traveled, even as short as something like 1 foot?
Thanks for that question. It's a good one, actually, and we worked on that. I'm not on the technical side of it, so I don't recall what we landed on, but we did come across what happens if someone starts a scooter and the trip, there's no true trip, or there's a mistake or whatnot. So I think we put together some combination of time and or distance to indicate that there's actually been movement of the scooter versus just a start, stop, and the same location, or which could be just about anything. We're still going to be piloting a lot of this stuff. So as it comes and we begin, invoicing to the companies, they're going to be helping us figure out, hey, this is, this seems like it might be a mistake for this invoice, and we'll be able to track again, where the scooter went, location wise. So if it didn't go anywhere location wise, we'd be able to fix that in the process. And also, I just wanted to answer another quick question. Someone asked it in the Q&A and I responded, but then it disappeared in that section, and it was about the block faces. I had misspoke about the block faces. It was really, we created drop zones in the Venice area, but the drop zones are on a lot of different blocks. You have about 25 different drop zones on each block, or 1 per block, give or take. So we require a deployment of 5 per company per drop zone, which essentially ends up being per block, but it's not on the block face. So just wanted to answer that really quickly.
Awesome, thank you. There's another question that got answered, so it kind of disappeared from the open Q&A, but I think there might be some more kind of meat there, and perhaps Ride Report and Todd might have something to say. But the question is from Hayes, and it's, what applications of policy API are you or partners exploring for rideshare or food delivery?
I can start with this. So rideshare in particular is something that Ride Report is focused on, and I think in general has talked with PBOT about as an eventual implementation of the API. I think the way we're thinking about it is that micromobility is our sandbox, and we want to make sure that it works with micromobility, with shared scooters and bikes first, before delving into TNCs. But that is something that's on our radar, and I think something we're excited about, as it gives sort of the control back into the hands of city managers, which we want them to be able to manage their right of way in the most environmentally friendly and sustainable way possible.
Maybe just building on that from the PBOT perspective, I think similar to LADOT, I think, and probably other cities, I think we have interest in getting all new mobility service providers into kind of MDS so that we're able to understand and efficiently manage the transportation system, which is kind of our core responsibility. And as Jarvis kind of indicated, think about those ways that we can incentivize certain uses of the transportation system that help us advance our goals, like electric vehicles, and potentially create those disincentives for those elements that, that do not necessarily do that. So I think that's just kind of I'd say a broad aim, and recognizing some of those things might take some time, but there's definitely an interest in that.
Yeah, and also just point to there is the beginnings of a CURB working group that are coming together, and I think all of this is going to very much matter when you start talking about CURB and what the workflows feel like and what the policies look like. You're going to see a lot of great conversations coming up and collaborations between everybody here.
Awesome. We don't have any more open questions at the moment. I think one of the things, broadly speaking, that came up when folks are registering this, which might be a good note to end on, is just around some of the current challenges, right? As we're kind of really moving into kind of implementation and operationalizing this. Of course, there are some challenges. So maybe if someone can speak to some of the challenges and that they have in their kind of current implementation, and perhaps what they would like to see in terms of moving forward.
I physically raised my hand, so I think as many on the call might be aware, Portland's been in the news a lot recently, and from a scooter perspective, I think we've had a lot of dynamic events that we've been managing sometimes on a daily basis, and had operating restrictions and curfews on scooters, scooters, as well as a lot of other things were used in some early rioting, and with continued kind of protests for racial justice. This has been a space that's been incredibly dynamic for us. And it's been beneficial. We've kind of recently started to kind of put some of these policies into kind of the Ride Report tool so that they're shared and communicated more clearly with operators. And at the same time, it's been hard because things are dynamic. The transportation system changes, events change on a daily basis. And so I think that's kind of both a promise and an opportunity, as Todd might have said early on, in terms of, in the future being able to manage, unplanned events. This has kind of been a real space that we've been in, and it's been great to try and use the tools, but it's also been really hard to use the tools as well.
Absolutely. One other question that popped up here too, which I would love to touch on for all of our folks from Europe who are joining very late at night, which is amazing. Thank you. But would someone like to speak to, the potential for expansion into Europe, or if there are any European countries that are still using this, Yasha, or that are using this? Yasha, you might want to speak to that a little bit more, or Todd, perhaps, about the future in Europe.
Yeah, I'd be happy to speak to that. There are a number of European cities that are currently using MDS MDS provider API. To my knowledge, there are not any that have currently implemented policy, although I know that there are several that are evaluating it in the context of their micromobility programs. There's a couple of companies who serve the European market for data analytics platforms that have been actively engaged in figuring out how to implement policy in Europe. So there's definitely a lot of interest. We are excited to see MDS continue to serve and grow as a global data specification, and would welcome folks from Europe to reach out to us. We'd love to get you connected with the work and get you involved in some of our working groups so that we can make sure what we're building is useful for everyone that might want to put it to work.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to just jump in and add on to that. I think that, the reason MDS has sort of emerged as a spec that has worked on regulating micromobility first is because cities here in the US, the levers to regulate micromobility are often more accessible than the levers to regulate other modes. And I think one of the reasons I'm excited about the potential for expansion to Europe is that in terms of things like congestion pricing and general sort of reallocation of the public right of way, I think that there's a little bit more of an established status quo for proactive policy implementations in European cities like London and Stockholm and Copenhagen that I think might be a really good fit for MDS policy going forward. But I think that, you know, the main bottleneck right now is getting providers of other modes of transportation beyond micromobility to the table. And I think that, you know, the working groups here at OMF are a great way to start doing that.
Awesome. Well, we're almost out of time. There's a couple more great questions that cropped up that we would love to answer offline. So I'm going to end this with a little bit of a call to action. We have a newsletter that you can sign up for on our website at openmobilityfoundation.org that we'll use to share additional resources and questions answered about this, about the policy API and our work and the work of our members. You can also check out our GitHub, follow us on Twitter. The purpose of these events is to really kind of foster community and keep the conversation going even when the webinar is over. So highly encourage you to connect with us there. And again, we will share resources, contact information where appropriate, et cetera, in a post-email or post-event wrap-up email. So keep an eye out for that as well. Thank you so much to all our amazing participants. Thank you so much to our speakers, panelists, for sharing so much about the work that you do and being kind of open and honest about some of the challenges that you face. Yeah, we really appreciate it. And thanks to all for coming. There will also be, the recording will be available so that you can share it with folks. And with that, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks everybody for coming.